Right, well, welcome everyone back to Thinking Space. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that our Zoom attendees are located on across Australia. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I'll advise that this session will be partially recorded and from our first talk, and then it will be available on our YouTube channel to rewatch if you're interested. So today we have two postgraduate speakers. The first is Madeline Miller, who's a third-year PhD student in the School of Environment and Society at the University of New South Wales, and her research is situated between the fields of environmental humanities and more than human geography. And her current work is focused on the social, cultural, and political dimensions of agriculture and environmental change, which includes the implications for alternative forms of care and restoration, which is propelled by this more than human nature nexus. So our talk today is on restoring livestock agriculture for climate change.
Thank you. Hello everybody. Thanks so much for coming. So yeah, thanks Emma. So I'm Maddie and I'm a third year, pushing fourth year, soon to be submitting PhD student at UNSW. And so typically I talk with notes, but today I'm just going to experiment with styling, see how that goes. But yeah, I want to talk to you a bit about the research that I've been doing with my PhD thesis. I feel like I could potentially talk forever on this, so I'm going to set stopwatch timer. Okay. So my research is looking at this alternative agricultural movement called regenerative agriculture. Have any of you guys heard of that before? Back at the back, yeah, you've done your PhD on it. I'll explain a bit about what that is and also kind of the take that I'm doing with my thesis. And today I want to focus a little bit about the ways in which this particular alternative agricultural movement is restoring livestock agriculture, which is typically, been associated with environmental destruction and kind of like the villain of climate change. And in this particular movement, we're seeing like an alternative kind of form of environmentalism emerging, and we're seeing this kind of restoring of livestock as kind of like the heroes of climate change. And I want to kind of think through, what that kind of means in the Australian context. Okay, so I'm going to start off with talking about, what's the problem with, eating beef? What's the problem with farming sheep and cattle? And then I'll describe what regenerative agriculture is. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about the carbon farming aspect of regenerative agriculture as practitioners and advocates of regenerative agriculture are starting to kind of think of themselves more as carbon farmers as well as kind of cattle farmers, and what that means in the context of climate change, and how this kind of and I want to talk to you a little bit about their kind of preoccupation with soil health and the kind of enchantment with kind of the liveliness of soils as practitioners move away from kind of, they critique the kind of input-output model of industrial agriculture and instead start to develop this kind of neo-agrarian, kind of Anglo-Celtic, kind of mystical relationship with soils. And I'm going to contextualize all of this with histories of human-cattle relationships in Australia, kind of histories of pastoralism, as well as the kinds of discourse around nature as guides and kind of mimicking nature and the ways in which the practices of regenerative practitioners are based in biomimicry. That's quite a lot, and we'll see if I get there. So you're all probably familiar with ideas like this. Like, this is just a screenshot from a Guardian article a few months ago, what's the beef with cows and the climate crisis, and in the article it details, you know, the kind of causal relationships, effects that livestock agriculture has on environmental change. So you know this, livestock sector is, you know, one of the biggest significant contributors to environmental degradation on a, you know, planetary scale, but also in the Australian context. Grazing land, you know, land is cleared for grazing, causing deforestation, pollution of waterways, biodiversity loss and the loss of habitat, etc. And also there's all of the methane that's emitted from the animals themselves, but also all the greenhouse gas, the carbon dioxide that's emitted in the kind of transportation, etc. of the animals, the production and consumption of them as well. And so I came across this crazy statistic that livestock, you know, they're huge drivers of planetary ecological change, and they comprise of 65% of all terrestrial vertebrates by weight, compared with just 3% for wildlife. And as, you know, human populations grow across the globe, demand for beef and dairy products is increasing. And so the global herd is expected to increase from 1.5 billion animals, that was in the year 2000, to 2.9 billion in the year 2050. So livestock have an incredible impact across the globe. So in response to the kinds of critiques of the effects of livestock and you know, the factory farming of animals and the effects of industrial agriculture on the environment, we're seeing this kind of new discourse, a new kind of environmentalism emerging from within the agricultural sector. And in it, we see the restoring of livestock as kind of these heroes of climate change. So this first image here is of a book cover, typical of kind of regenerative discourse. And so this kind of regenerative agriculture as an idea has kind of been around, I think, since maybe it was like the 1980s, and it's kind of boomed in popularity the past kind of 5 years, 8 to 5 years. Although there's a lot of farmers who have been practicing kind of alternative agricultural practices for a while under different kind of banners, you know, with organics and agroecology, and now kind of, I'd say, regenerative agriculture is having a bit of a moment. And all of those discourses have emerged in critique of industrial paradigms of kind of mastery, domination, and control. And so you can see in the middle image is an infographic that you know, if you log into a lot of regenerative kind of social media, like sites, platforms, and then also websites. For you attending, if they're workshops, these kind of images abound, and so it's detailing this idea that cattle are actually really good for the climate. You can have a kind of net benefit, because if you graze animals in a kind of ecological way, in ways that kind of mimic nature, and I'll talk a bit about that in more detail in a sec, but you can kind of promote the kind of growth of healthy pastures, and then healthy pastures promote photosynthesis, and they pull in carbon and kind of sequester it in the soil. So you're pulling in carbon, and then as I'll talk about in a little bit, there's this kind of boom in kind of carbon farming, and so practitioners are starting to be quite hopeful about what they call like the carbon gold rush, selling carbon credits from these kinds of practices to polluting industries. And the Australian government's invested quite a bit of money into this. And so Call of the Reed Warbler, you may have come across this. This is by Charles Massey. He's an Australian farmer from the Monaro region in New South Wales. He's become a bit of a mouthpiece, a spokesperson, a key figure in this space. And he has written this book. It's huge, and in it, it's based off his PhD project where he interviewed a whole range of regenerative farmers in Australia, and his book is called Call of the Reed Warbler: New Agriculture, a New Earth, and so he's kind of positioning regenerative practices and regenerative agriculture as this kind of, you know, planetary savior, the dawn of a new kind of time. So, you know, there's lots of different kind of techno-scientific, futuristic visions, utopic visions for agriculture, and transitions to a more kind of sustainable environmental future. But regenerative agriculture tends to kind of look to the past and idealize, you know, agricultural practices that have kind of come before industrialization, and the kind of mechanization of a lot of the agriculture that supports our ways of life now. And so I describe it as a kind of neo-agrarian alternative food movement, and there's a huge kind of literary bent to this movement, and a lot of books like Charles Massey's Call of the Reed Warbler have been published, and they're often kind of these biographical accounts of like farmers, you know, their kind of their journey and transition towards a more kind of regenerative relationship with the land. And in it, they often quote, you know, Wendell Berry and Aldo Leopold and other kind of agrarianists, and they often espouse these notions of environmental stewardship, which promote this idea that, you know, farmers have this kind of authentic, originary, embodied relationship to the land. So it's an ecological, I describe it as kind of like a nature-based approach to land care. So farmers are looking at ecological systems as a whole instead of that kind of input-output industrial model of farming. So they're looking at, you know, the animals and the ecosystem and the plants and the soils and the carbon as part of this interwoven nexus, where everything kind of is in relation to each other. And so they describe, it's an umbrella term, and there's a variety of different practices and principles that all farmers kind of do. Everyone kind of does something a bit different. But something they all do describe is that practice of mimicking nature. And so, and a key, so for my project, I interviewed, it was during lockdowns, so I did this all via Zoom, but I interviewed a range of farmers who identified as regenerative from New South Wales. And so some of the pictures that you see, because I couldn't go visit their properties, so I asked them to send me images of like significant aspects of their farming enterprises. And I was interested in kind of documenting and analysing like their kind of expressions, articulations and representations of like healthy Australian landscapes, like what kind of claims of restoration are being made in this space, what kind of politics of nature being mobilised and deployed here. So something that all the farmers seem they all did, all the ones that spoke to me, was this practice of rotational grazing. So that's where you, instead of kind of set stocking your animals, you split your property up into, we call that cell grazing, and you move your animals in ways that kind of mimic the grazing patterns of wild herbivores as they might move across, say, like the plains of Africa, like in the Serengeti as wildebeest move in search of fresh food and water pursued by predators, etc., or even bison in the United States. But, you know, here in Australia, I was curious, like, what kinds of animals are you replicating? What kind of ecological niche are cattle filling here? And it was interesting talking to them. You know, some farmers spoke about megafauna and the diprotodons and filling that kind of ecological niche. They said, so a quote from one participant who said something like, giant herbivores have been in Australia for a long time and in a lot greater numbers than they are today. So it's kind of interesting, specific, politics of nature and claims of restoration articulated here. And so rotational grazing, as I mentioned before, it kind of stimulates plant growth. And this has kind of led to this carbon farming practice. So this is, I would say, in its infancy. There's a lot of kind of hope for this practice. There's only a handful of people who have actually sold carbon credits so far, but there's quite a few registered. And so in response to this, there's a whole suite of carbon brokers who have emerged as well, like this one here. This is just a screenshot from the website, Select Carbon. Yeah, and it was interesting to note on their website, I saw that Shell, you know, the petrochemical company, had bought 100% of this corporation in October 2020. There's a few things at play here. Yeah, I think Shell, they're playing chess, not checkers, in terms of energy transition. What does the science say about the potential for carbon trading and carbon farming and the sequestration of carbon through changed land management practices and holistic grazing? There's a lot of critique. And there's this kind of tension that I saw in my interviews between farmers and the ways in which their relationship with science. And part of my thesis looks at the kind of knowledge politics that play here. As farmers, you know, they evoke this kind of spiritual kind of embodied kind of intimacy with the soil, and this, you know, expertise, I think, is rendered through, you know, multi-generational attachment to place, and having like worked physically with the land. And there seemed to be a bit of a critique of these outsider experts coming in and kind of critiquing their practices. But, you know, there's this, but at the same time, they rely on science, and, you know, to be able to continue pursue this practice of carbon farming, you know, science needs to be kind of with them on this. And there's a lot of like hope in this emergent space. So part of what I look at is that kind of, one of my chapters is about regenerative, or thinking with soils, regenerative relationships with soils. It's kind of split in between thinking with soils, thinking with grass, and thinking with cattle, potentially sheep and cattle. And I was quite curious about the ways in which regenerative practitioners were quite preoccupied with soil health and how it mobilized that kind of mystical, mythological relationship to the natural environment. And I kind of contextualize it with earlier histories of, the anxieties around declining soil health and soil erosion, and that rise with alternative agriculture and how it kind of intersects with ideas about nature and nation, as agronomic progress is tied to the fate of not only the nation, but these like bigger themes of salvation, like the demise and then salvation of civilization. And I think so organic agriculture kind of already did this in the kind of, as it responded to earlier anxieties in like the 30s and 40s around soil erosion, and the dust bowls and things happened then. And I think, science and knowledge about climate, anxieties and preoccupations around restoring health of soils, that's always been tied to ideas about Australia as a kind of productive agricultural nation. And here I'm kind of contextualizing it within anxieties around carbon markets and this bigger context of more permanent climate change instead of that cyclical boom and bust cycles related to La Nina and El Nino. So I'm out of time. But I guess as a kind of parting few comments, so what my thesis does is look at the kind of framing of regenerative agriculture as this nature-based solution, and this kind of restoring of livestock as ecologically restorative agents in the Australian landscape. Agriculture, the villain, is not the hero in this story. We're seeing this framing of eating meat as part of a caring and conscious framework, particularly in the context of climate change. So it's a new form of environmentalism, one that's really different from conventional concerns around biodiversity conservation and wilderness protection and things like that. And as ideas are pulled from diverse global geographies and overlain in kind of the Australian context, you see this kind of this mobilization and idea of this production of this like singular idea of nature. There's no real interest in this form of environmentalism of distinguishing between, native versus non-native dualisms that we otherwise see. Yeah, so it's looking to the past, neo-agrarian pasts, mobilizing this kind of shifting ecological baseline to lay claims to a kind of more stable climate future to justify contemporary cattle-centric practices. I'll just end it there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Maddie.
That's
I think
okay.
we've got time for one or two quick questions if anyone in the audience has anything.
Hi, Beck.
Can I ask a question? I've always loved your work. From the first time we ever talked about it, critiquing the claims of regen ag. And this is great to see the fruition of it. And so I guess around livestock, and I know that the beef industry at the moment, that's their big promise, that they're going to feed livestock seaweed and sequester all the carbons.
Yeah.
But then, regen ag is in grazing for a reason, right? Because it's even harder to look at regen ag and cropping and other non-livestock forms of farming. Did any of your respondents talk about what they would do instead if they could? Like if they could move away from beef, where would they go? And then the other part of that question is, did any of them discuss carbon farming outside of markets and mitigation, and in fact identifying with that on that more stewardship level, wanting to build carbon, not for generation?
As a product, like
no, just as part of what they do rather than as a product to sell.
Yes.
Like being a carbon farmer is like a duty, yeah.
Yeah, they did actually. I didn't ask them what they would do if they didn't farm cattle. Yeah, so I can't answer the first one, I'm not sure.
So we feel like they're pretty wedded to
Yeah,
stock production, you know.
they seem to be. I mean, I'm talking about like a diverse group of individuals, but yeah, you know, a lot of them have been through, you know, cycles of debt, and, you know, fires and floods, and had kind of come to regenerative practices, perhaps like through like disaster. And I felt like what I saw was that regenerative farming in this particular way, like enabled them to, I guess, farm in some kind of truth or something, that it spoke to like what they really wanted to do, which was to kind of take care of the land, in ways perhaps that they saw that their families previously, if they were multi-generational farmers, like didn't have capacity to do. But in terms of, did farmers farm carbon outside of markets, producing it as a commodity? Yes, they did. And yeah, I felt like they saw being able to farm carbon was just, it was just another way of maybe articulating like the restoration of the landscape, and you could quantify that by like testing the soil as well. So I felt like rebuilding soil health was such like a big part of their enterprise and their principles and practices, and articulating that in forms of like rebuilding carbon was like really significant. And not all of, and just one out of 20s, it's kind of a small, relatively small study. They said that they actually were actively against like selling carbon, just because they thought that it would actually not work out for the farmers, because you can't control climates, and they thought farmers would lose out in the end. Yeah, that is.
Great. Well, in the interest of time,
Sorry, yeah.
I think we'll just stop questions there, but I'm sure Maddie will be happy to answer any questions after the seminar, if you have some more. So thank you again, Maddie. Well, to sum up, thank you all for attending another thinking space. Our next thinking space will be the 24th of April, and we'll be hearing from Professor Joshua Siller about his research on the Ocean Resource Hub. So thank you.
Thanks so much.